Chapter 21. After work that day, Kaylyn went home, feeling like an accomplished woman. There was not much that she did, but the feeling of independence that consumed her was too great for her to feel anything else but happiness. As she opened the door to Matthew's house, Sapphire greeted her with a smile on her face. "I'm glad you're home," she squealed as she ran and hugged Kaylyn, who bent on her knees to properly receive the hug. "How was school today?" she asked, using her fingers to tuck some loose tendrils of hair behind her ear. "Okay," was the simple reply she got. "Daddy isn't home yet. He always works late, but my nanny is here." "Would you like to meet her?" she asked, pulling Kaylyn towards the kitchen as she stood. Kaylyn laughed and followed behind. They came upon the kitchen and Kaylyn glanced at the woman who had her back turned while preparing something over the stove. She was petite, with long blonde hair flowing down her slender back. "Liz!" Sapphire exclaimed loudly, and the woman slightly jumped, frightened. She turned around and Kaylyn was finally able to see her face. She was probably in her 30s, Kaylyn thought. Upon seeing Kaylyn, Liz smiled, dusting her hands into the apron around her waist. "Oh, hello. You must be Kaylyn. Sapphire has told me a lot about you," she exclaimed enthusiastically, moving towards Kaylyn. Kaylyn smiled at the kindness in the woman's tone, as she stretched forth her hand for a handshake. "That's right," she chuckled. "It's nice to meet you," she greeted, watching from the corner of her eyes as Sapphire stood watching the exchange with a proud smile on her little face. "Likewise," Liz smiled, and then went back to her pot. "I'm just about done with dinner. It will be served in about 5 minutes tops," she provided, guessing that they might be hungry. "Come on, Kaylyn, I've got to show you something I made at school today," Sapphire exclaimed eagerly, once again pulling Kaylyn in her desired direction. Liz turned and smiled and Kaylyn returned it before stumbling behind an eager Sapphire. Matthew sat at the counter of the closest bar he could find from his workplace. He had been sitting, waiting for Jason for about 5 minutes now, and he was quite frankly, getting tired of waiting. He wondered if Kaylyn was already home, or if she was staying behind with Jason at work. Matthew suddenly felt angered by the mere thought. As she pulled his phone from his pocket and began to dial Jason's number, he felt a pat on his shoulder. He brought the phone down from his ear when Jason came into view. Sighing in relief, he shut the phone in his pocket. "Took you long enough," he argued, and Jason chuckled lightly. "Scotch please," he told the bartender who was not far away, then he leveled his gaze at Matthew. "What's up?" he asked. "I need you to fire Kaylyn," he blurted firmly, and Jason stared at him unblinkingly for some passing seconds, before he laughed. "Funny," he said, still grinning. Matthew sighed. Frustratingly. "Does it look like I'm joking, idiot?" he sneered. Jason snorted, taking the glass from the bartender as he turned it to his head, taking a sip. "Well, you are either joking or insane," he quipped, baring his teeth at the taste of the liquor. "Look, are you blind? Can't you see she's pregnant?" Matthew snapped. Jason nodded. "Yes, pregnant, not disabled," he pointed out slowly to Matthew, a bit surprised that he considered Kaylyn's health so important. Matthew raked his hand through his hair in aggravation, and then took a long gulp of his drink. "I don't want her working, damn it, and she won't listen to me." "You're my only hope," he exclaimed with a tinge of desperation to his tone. Jason gaped intently at his friend, noting the lines of tension that smeared his face. He understood what he was saying, and as a matter of fact, he wouldn't want his woman working during pregnancy either, but in order for him to get to Kaylyn, he had to be around her. "It won't kill her," he replied drily. Matthew slammed his hand to the counter. "Why are you such an ass? Don't you see what I'm doing here? Don't you remember what happened to Marcia?" he asked angrily. "I'm being responsible. Having the woman under my roof alone will not suffice," he spat angrily. The cup froze at Jason's mouth when he heard the last bit of Matthew's sentence. "Under your roof?" he asked in clarification. "Yes, damn it, I convinced her to move in with me a few days ago," he informed, and Jason placed his beverage to the counter, his appetite for it suddenly gone. He wiped his mouth with his hand as he stared blankly at the polished surface. What about Catherine? He suddenly blurted, still finding his friend's revelation is quite incredulous. We broke things off after I told her about Kaylyn, Matthew told him in a more calm tone. Jason's head snapped towards Matthew in shock, his eyes wide with disbelief. You called off things with Catherine? He had to repeat to see if his hearing was probably playing tricks on him. Yes, are you deaf? Matthew hissed, watching the reaction of his friend. Of course, he must have found it shocking. Anyone would. So you and Kaylyn are now in. Jason trailed off, not wanting the last word to fall from his lips and confirm his fear. Item, he completed quickly. Matthew was hesitant with his answer, not knowing that his friend was probably shitting his pants with eagerness for a reply. No, he finally said, sounding a tad disappointed. Jason hadn't even realized he was holding his breath until Matthew spoke. The relief that swam through his body almost left him faint. He smiled inwardly, thinking all was not lost, and even though he would have to fight harder for this desired woman, he still felt an inkling of hope. I'm sorry Matthew my friend, but I will not fire Kaylyn. You'll have to think of something else, Jason exclaimed as he got up from his chair, patting Matthew emphatically on the back. He left Matthew there, boiling with anger. He muttered a loud curse, causing onlookers to turn. Matthew didn't know what else to do. What a good friend Jason was, he thought with dripping sarcasm. He sighed, knowing that there was not much more he could do to have his way. His phone suddenly rang and Matthew groaned, not wanting to talk to anyone. He answered anyway. Hello. His tone was unpleasant. Matthew, it's me. Catherine, the soft voice announced. Matthew pulled in a breath. Hi, he replied groggily. Well, I'm still awaiting an answer for the dinner party. Will you bring a date or not? I need to know so we can cater to the amount of guests we'll have, she explained softly. Matthew sighed heavily. Yes. I'll bring Kaylyn, he said, suddenly feeling exhausted. Okay she didn't have time to complete her sentence because Matthew disconnected the call, oblivious of what his confirmation to the dinner would bring. Chapter 22. A day before the dinner, Kaylyn came home from work, feeling a bit uneasy. Matthew still hadn't told her of his plan for Catherine's dinner, because he had not found the time, and well, he was a bit hesitant to ask her. As soon as Kaylyn arrived in her room, she plopped down on the bed, wanting to rid herself of the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She groaned when a knock on her door prevented her from doing so. Easing herself upwards, she cleared her throat. It's open, she called out, and the door suddenly opened, welcoming Matthew. May I have a word with you? He asked, moving towards her. Yeah, take a seat, she patted the space on the bed. Matthew faintly smiled and took a seat beside her on the soft bed. Clearing his throat, he began. I was wondering if you could be my date for a dinner party, tomorrow, he said. It took a while for Kaylyn to register what he was saying. She just wanted to sleep. Tomorrow? She asked, shocked that he would ask in such a spur-of-the-moment, surprised he would ask any at all. Couldn't you tell me this earlier so I could prepare myself? She asked in bewilderment. Sorry, it slipped my mind, he justified lamely. So, you're saying yes? He asked brightly. No. No, to my last question or no to the party? He asked, wanting clarification. I don't know yet. I kind of wanted the day for myself tomorrow, considering I wouldn't have work, she said between sighs, rubbing her forehead. Are you all right? Matthew asked, concerned. Yeah. I'm just tired, she assured, and Matthew scrutinized her, unconvinced. He still hadn't found a way to have her quit the job. The woman was tired, and the baby was probably tired too, but she was so hard-headed he didn't know what else to do. Do you need to see the doctor? He asked, thinking that maybe he needed to stop asking, but demand and act. No, I'm fine, she quickly put in. Kaylyn, have you done a checkup since you found out you were pregnant? Matthew asked, wishing to God she wouldn't confirm his fear. She hung her head guiltily. I haven't had the time, she blurted in defense, staring blankly at the wall before her. Matthew stared at her in disbelief for a while, his mouth slightly opened with disbelief. Are you out of your damned mind, woman? He spat angrily, his words not loud but low and steely. Kaylyn's head snapped in his direction when the words left his mouth. Don't you dare speak to me like that, she warned prickly. Matthew flew from the bed. And what are you gonna do? He flung his hand in the air in frustration, his anger slowly consuming him. You are treating this child like it's non-existent. You don't listen when I talk to you, and you do not have this baby's best interest at heart. What kind of a mother will you be? He spat angrily, having no control of the words that flew from his lips. He decided that he had enough of her shenanigans. It was time he put his foot down and let her know who wore the pants in the house, but he immediately regretted the words that flew from his lips as soon as they spurted out. He knew that even though he was angry, he had no right to tell her such words, such hurtful words. He watched the way her body stiffened and the way her lips were trembling with the promise of tears. But she immediately sucked in up and ground her teeth, refusing to appear weak at the sight of Matthew mayhem. Matthew muttered a low curse, swiping his hand across his face. Kaylyn, I'm sorry, he exclaimed softly. I didn't mean to say what I said, he sighed, knowing that she wouldn't forgive him so easily. You said what you had to and the damage is done. The weight of the sobs pushing against her throat caused her to sound hoarse. Matthew scratched the back of his neck, moving closer to Kaylyn with the intention of soothing her. Don't come near me, she warned, and the steeliness in her tone prevented Matthew from doing so. I'm sorry, he said once more, wanting to kick himself for being an asshole. Kaylyn ignored him as she got up from the bed, moving towards the door. Matthew watched as she opened the door and stood, her intentions obvious. Get out. I'd like some rest now, she said in the deadliest tone Matthew had ever heard from a woman. He stood, transfixed in the area for a while, their gazes locking in a heated battle. She did not blink even once, and so Matthew knew that she was serious. He surrendered, and moved past her, pausing at the door to once again apologize, but before he could do so, the door separated them both. Matthew sighed heavily, resting his forehead on the surface, before he turned to go to his room. Sapphire stood before him, with her arms crossed and a little scowl on her face. I'm disappointed in you, Daddy, she scolded, not even pronouncing disappointed right. Matthew sighed, another stubborn female to deal with. I said some hurtful things, he said, not intending for Sapphire to overhear their argument. Yes. And you used bad words. You also made Kaylyn cry, which is not nice, she pouted. I know, honey, and I told her sorry, Saying sorry won't make her hurt less, Daddy, she stated, and Matthew stared at her in disbelief. Where did you learn all this? Matthew asked with a smile. Sapphire sighed, rolling her eyes. Daddy, I'm 5, she fired back, and Matthew laughed. Sapphire, though, was not laughing. You need to do something nice for Kaylyn, and if you don't, I won't talk to you either, she warned, then stomped off to her room. Matthew huffed out a breath before he sauntered to his room. Women. That night, he fell asleep thinking of ways to make it up to Kaylyn. He knew that she wouldn't agree to the dinner now, and quite frankly, he wasn't planning on going either. Chapter 23. It was the day of the dinner, and Kaylyn was still not talking to Matthew. His words had rested in her thoughts for the entire night, thus depriving her of sleep. Deep down, she understood his anger, but she still couldn't help feeling hurt. What right did he have to feel hurt anyway? He had no initial interest in the baby, and he had dragged her to his house against her will. If anybody should be upset about anything, it should be her. Sapphire entered the room when Kaylyn was making her bed. Although the door was opened, she paused and knocked, waiting for permission to fully enter. Kaylyn smiled at the sight of her in her Dora pajama suit. Come in, she told her, and Sapphire walked towards her, then hugged her legs. The act took Kaylyn by surprise. Are you okay, Kaylyn? She asked, looking up at her. Kaylyn grinned. I am, she assured her, gently using her hand to smoothen her hair. Are you sure? She asked, raising a brow. I'm sure, she said, and Sapphire was still not convinced, but she decided to let it go. What will you do today? She asked cheerfully, with a grin on her face. I want to relax, and then maybe visit the doctor in the afternoon, she informed, and the smile fell from Sapphire's face. Doctor? She exclaimed questioningly. I knew you weren't okay, she hissed, pouting. Kaylyn chuckled lightly. I just want to make sure the baby's okay, she assured her, using her fingers to tuck the flaying tendrils of hair behind Sapphire's ear. Oh, she exclaimed, smiling. There was a small silence, and Kaylyn figured what she would ask next. Can I come? She chirped. Kaylyn grinned, knowing she was right. Of course you can, she told her, and Sapphire squealed out in excitement, jumping in Kaylyn's hand, which caused them to both fall on the bed, laughing hard. Matthew sat, drinking coffee, when he finally decided to call Catherine and tell her he would no longer be attending the dinner. Hello, Matthew, she answered warmly. Hey, it's about the dinner. I won't be able to make it. Why? She quickly asked, and anyone who knew of her plans could hear the sudden distress that rang out in her voice. Kaylyn isn't feeling too well, he decided to say, instead of filling in her on the details. Oh, came the flat reply. Yes, so I'm sorry, he told her. But surely, she may feel better by tonight, she quickly blurted, wanting so much to plant another option in his head. She needs rest, Catherine, Matthew said, getting agitated. Well, look who finally decided to be a family man, she choked out a laugh. And the funny thing is, the child probably isn't yours, she said, now, the darker side of her making itself known. Matthew laughed at the sudden change of personality. All this was some ploy to lure Kaylyn there so you could embarrass her, wasn't it? Matthew asked when realization dawned. Who said you weren't a smart man? She mocked, telling him he was indeed correct. And now it will backfire in your face, you sick bitch, he hissed angrily, flabbergasted by the fact that the woman would even consider doing such a thing. He immediately hung up the phone without hearing a reply from the minx. If she had any thoughts in her sick brain that she would hurt Kaylyn or his child, she would be sadly mistaken. Catherine grounded her teeth when she heard the beeping on the other line, which indicated that Matthew had disconnected the call. Muttering a loud curse, she pulled the phone from its cable and threw it into the wall. She raked her fingers through her hair and paced the office floor, biting her nails while she thought she couldn't believe that the man had cancelled at the last minute, just when she was reveling in the whole idea of everything. She chewed on her nails, abandoning them when she spotted a bottle of vodka in the far end of the room on a table. She quickly dashed towards it and poured herself a glass, downing the entire thing in one go. She bared her teeth at the taste and moved around the table as she took a seat in a chair. She was deep in thought for a few minutes before an idea came to her. She quickly pulled her cell phone from her bag and eagerly dialed Lilith Fisher's phone number. Hello, this is Lilith Fisher, Lilith. It's Catherine, she quickly said in her most composed tone. Oh, Catherine darling. How are you? The woman exclaimed excitedly. Catherine rolled her eyes in frustration, never liking the woman for chatting so much. I'm wonderful, dear. Are you guys still heading here for the dinner? She asked, twirling her finger around the rim of the glass as she awaited her answer. Why, of course, sweetheart. We are leaving home now for our flight at noon, Lilith provided, and Catherine grinned. Wonderful, she exclaimed before lowering her tone. But you know, Lilith, Matthew dear is not feeling so well, and so we postponed the party, but he insisted that you guys come and have dinner with us, at his home, she told the woman on the other end, every word a lie. Oh, poor Matthew. Well, that's fine, dear. We will still attend. Anything for a friend, Lilith said softly. I'll meet you guys at the airport and escort you to his house then, she exclaimed and smiled, knowing she was not yet defeated. Chapter 24. It was 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and Kaylyn was getting dressed to have a checkup at the doctor's. She knew it was probably late for her to be going, but a nagging feeling of fear kept on creeping up on her, so procrastination made her late. She was bounding her hair in a ponytail when Matthew appeared at her door. She sighed upon seeing him, ignoring him to continue what she was doing. Matthew leaned against the door post with his hands crossed, scrutinizing her. Going somewhere? He decided on asking, even though he was quite sure she wouldn't grace him with a reply. We're going to check up on baby, Daddy, Sapphire answered, entering the room, in a flared tail dress and shower-fresh face. Matthew glanced at her, then at Kaylyn in confusion, wondering what she was talking about. Kaylyn turned to him and used the tip of her tongue to moisten her lips, before she spoke. I should have asked you permission first, I'm sorry, she said, knowing that Matthew might be a little upset with her decision to have Sapphire accompany her. Matthew huffed out a breath in disbelief. So you're going for a checkup without informing me? He cocked a brow in question, a bit taken aback by the fact that he was excluded in her decision-making. I didn't think you'd want to come, Kaylyn tried to justify calmly. Well, I beg to differ, he exclaimed, crossing his arms. Kaylyn sighed, looking down on Sapphire, who was staring up at them both while they spoke. It's just a checkup. You don't need to be there, she said, knowing that she was depriving him a part in the baby's life with her insistence, but she was nervous to have him accompany her. I don't think there needs to be an argument here. It's final. I'm accompanying you, he said, and the tone in his voice told Kaylyn that his decision was indeed final. Kaylyn sighed in defeat. Fine. A smile edged at the corners of Matthew's mouth. Superb. I'll go change, he exclaimed. Kaylyn looked down on him, legs snugly fitted into faded jeans and a t-shirt that exposed too much of his manly attributes. She swallowed. Okay, she said, casting her eyes from the sight of him to the floor. Matthew smiled before exiting the room, feeling like a winner because he knew that even though his words had hurt her, she had still pondered upon them and decided to do the right thing. He still needed to make it up to her, but that was for later. Right now he was going to hear news of his growing bundle of joy. Humming, he escaped to his room, feeling immensely happy for the turn his life was taking. Kaylyn and Sapphire was in the kitchen having water while they waited for Matthew to make his appearance so they could leave. Kaylyn was rinsing out the used glasses when the doorbell rang. I'll get it. Sapphire exclaimed, already exiting the kitchen to do so. Sapphire, wait. Kaylyn called, not wanting her to open the door to any potential strangers. Sapphire, however, ignored Kaylyn's call and dashed to the front to open the door. Sighing, Kaylyn quickly wiped her hands and quickly moved towards the front door. Catherine rang the doorbell, eagerly waiting to make her appearance. I thought you lived here, dear. Why are you ringing the doorbell? Lilith asked from behind, and Catherine swallowed, trying to quickly formulate a reply to satiate the prying Lilith Fisher. I haven't moved in yet. Although I did have a key, but I forgot it, she lied convincingly, and was glad when she didn't get a reply. The door opened with Catherine's gaze focused ahead, not seeing who opened the door. Her gaze lowered when she heard the clearing of a throat and her eyes then locked with Sapphire's. Catherine gritted her teeth, but then forced a smile. Hi honey, she cooed, bending to squeeze Sapphire's cheeks. Sapphire sported a frown, brushing at Catherine's hand when her fingers tightly pinched her cheeks. Ouch! Sapphire squealed, rubbing at her cheeks as she used her gaze to throw daggers at Catherine. We are going out now, you'll have to come back later, she told her, pouting. What a rude child. Lilith said from behind, her tone bitter. Sapphire leaned her head, staring up at the Fishers. She thought the man had a pleasant face, but the woman reminded her of Catherine. Who are you? She asked them. I am Patrick Fisher, and this is my wife Lilith Fisher. Patrick smiled, thinking that she was the most adorable little girl he had ever seen. He had longed for grandkids, but he wasn't sure he would be privileged with one considering the time he might have left and the fact that his only daughter was furious with him, and out of reach. You have the same last name as Kaylyn, Sapphire provided, smiling at the man he thought to have a slight resemblance to Kaylyn. Kaylyn? Patrick and Lilith both said in unison, both a bit curious. Catherine rolled her eyes. Excuse us little Sapphire, who is at the dude Kaylyn asked coming around the corner, but suddenly paused when she saw who it was. she gasped, her body stiffening with what her eyes had witnessed. Kaylyn? Patrick gasped, his tongue feeling heavy with the weight of his words. Kaylyn couldn't form words, as her shock had left her speechless. She stared ahead at the two persons she never thought she'd see again. It had been years, but this moment had only served to revive her memories. Her throat felt dry and her body felt numb, and the same things was happening to her father, but her mother, however, although shocked, was not otherwise affected. "What's going on here?" Matthew asked upon seeing the small crowd at the door. He glanced from Kaylyn to Catherine. "What the hell are you doing here with the fist dash?" He paused, glancing from them to the shocked Kaylyn. Realization dawned and Matthew muttered a low curse in disbelief. Well, happy family reunion." Catherine laughed, stepping past them to enter the house. All were in shock, except Catherine and a clueless Sapphire. "You see, Lilith, Patrick. Matthew and I broke things off, because he got another woman pregnant," Catherine started off saying. "That woman is your dear daughter Kaylyn. So you see, I'm left unhappy, because your daughter is a home wrecker," she hissed bitterly, and Lilith's gasp could be heard from a mile away. She moved towards Kaylyn in the house, and slapped her squarely across the face in a hard and stinging slap. Kaylyn gasped, frightened. Angrily Matthew pulled himself from his phase and strolled to Lilith. "Don't you dare try that again, lady, or you will regret it," he warned in a steely tone, his face hardening with anger. Ignoring Matthew's warning, Lilith turned to Kaylyn. "You were always a little slut," she spat venomously. "You told a lie on that poor man years ago, when you couldn't have your way. When he didn't want to sleep with you. You wanted a man, and when you couldn't get him, you lied. You're a whore and you hold no relations to this family," she hissed, pointing an accusatory finger in Kaylyn's face. "That's it, get out of my house, now," Matthew roared. He didn't care if the woman was old and frail, she had no right coming into his house to point fingers. Holding her by the arm, he tried to usher her from the house, but Patrick's hand stopped him. "You cannot manhandle my wife, young man," he blazed angrily. "Then get her the hell out of here before I throw you out," he growled in angry frustration. "Just wait a sec. Are you defending her now, Matthew?" Catherine cut in crisply. "Don't even fuck dash," he held back the curse word, remembering. "Sapphire. Get out. You'll regret this," he snarled. All engaged in the chaotic conversation did not realize Kaylyn had ventured into a half-bathroom below the staircase. All the things that she suddenly had to face made her sick to the stomach, causing her to take the quick trip. She returned after finding out something that shattered all her composure. Barely able to find the strength in her feet to walk, she nevertheless managed and came back to the door where everyone was, still immensely riled up. She looked as pale as paper and felt breathless and incredibly panicked. Sapphire was the first to witness her ghastly state. She looked as though she was about to faint, and that was what caused Sapphire to panic. "Kaylyn!" Sapphire screamed, rushing to her side. Matthew's blood ran cold upon hearing the hysteria in his daughter's voice. He snapped his head around and he could feel the blood drain from his face when he saw the state Kaylyn was in. Unhesitatingly, Matthew dashed to her side, holding her up, while he examined her face. Her eyes were weary and her face, moonlight pale. "There's blood," she said in a strained tone, and Matthew gulped, feeling his own body grow weak. Chapter 25. Bleeding can be normal during pregnancy, but I'm going to do an ultrasound to ensure that it isn't anything more serious, the doctor informed as Kaylyn sat on the bed, sobbing. Matthew's face was flushed with concern as he stood there, trying to process the words the doctor was telling them. His body still had not recovered from the shock of seeing Kaylyn looking as she did earlier, hearing the words that had left her mouth. He had driven at bullet speed, taking all the chances he could to get Kaylyn to the hospital. Her cries, coupled with Sapphire's, had almost driven him to insanity. He had wanted to stop the moving vehicle and comfort them, but he knew he couldn't. Now watching her, still crying, Matthew was finding it hard to hold back his own tears. He was fearful for Kaylyn as well as the baby. Now, he wasn't even sure there was one. He swallowed hard, trying to fight the heaviness of impending tears that rested on his throat. One arm was folded tightly across his chest as he pressed his fist to his mouth anxiously. His phone rang and Matthew almost jumped at the sound. Scratching his head, he contemplated on whether or not he should take the call, but when he saw that it was Liz, he immediately answered. Turning to one corner of the room, he spoke. "Hey Liz," he sounded frail, and so he cleared his throat. He had called Liz earlier, to keep an eye on Sapphire while he attended to Kaylyn. "Hey, I'm here at the hospital." "Where is Sapphire?" she asked. "I'll be out to talk to you," he said, disconnecting the call. Turning to take a look at Kaylyn, who was getting ready for the examination, he quickly excused himself and left the room. He found Liz wandering in the passage. "Hey," he called, and she turned, walking briskly to him. "I left Sapphire with a nurse at the front. She must still be crying. Please calm her," he pleaded, saddened by the fact that he couldn't do it himself. Liz nodded and placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder, sympathetically. "How's Kaylyn?" she asked. Matthew exhaled heavily. "She's getting ready for an ultrasound to determine the baby's state." Aye. He trailed off, unable to finish, as he placed his fist to his mouth, briefly closing his eyes in an effort to compose himself. Liz gently massaged his shoulder. "Everything will be fine, Matthew. You need to have faith that God will work on your behalf," she consoled, and a tear slipped from Matthew's eyes. He quickly brushed it off and raked his hand through his hair. "Yeah. Better get back inside. Tell Sapphire Daddy loves her," he exclaimed, and Liz nodded, managing a sad smile. After Liz left him, he leaned his head against the wall, palms on the surface as he tightly closed his eyes. Sighing heavily, Matthew quickly sauntered into the room where he found the doctor placing a gel on Kaylyn's slightly rounded tummy. He gulped, nervously walking towards the bed. Kaylyn had stopped crying, but the tear streaks were still visible on her flushed face. She turned to glance at him, and her lips trembled suddenly. Matthew stood beside her, wanting so much to comfort her, but he didn't exactly know how. He had no experience towards the kind of emotion he was feeling. It was new to him at this stage, and he didn't know how to react to it. "This can be a very minor problem, so don't be too hard on yourselves," the doctor smiled at Matthew, seeing how tensed he was. As the doctor reached for the ultrasound transducer to spread the gel so they would be able to see what was going on, Matthew couldn't help gripping Kaylyn's hand. He gently squeezed it in reassurance, managing a stiff smile as Kaylyn looked up at him. She folded her lips and focused her gaze at the monitor as the doctor began to spread the gel in a circular motion, using the transducer. A little moving figure appeared on the screen and the doctor turned and smiled at them both. "That's the baby right there," he provided, allowing the parents to revel in the satisfaction of the life they had created, before he continued. A sob broke out from Kaylyn's lips, but she quickly used her hand to cover her mouth, failing to believe that she actually carried a life within her. The feeling she experienced was bittersweet, but she smiled nonetheless. Matthew managed a shaky laugh. "So he's okay?" he asked, swallowing the lump in his throat, and feeling the slight wave of relief that consumed him. "He or she still has life, if that's what you mean. I'll examine further to see if all is well," he stated, still examining the screen as his hands moved the device along Kaylyn's stomach. Kaylyn couldn't keep her eyes off the monitor, she was too overwhelmed to do anything else, but that. "This is the head," the doctor said, pointing to one particular area on the screen. "The heartbeat is strong," he trailed off and sighed. "But..." Matthew stiffened at the sudden change in his tone. But what?" he eagerly asked, his moment of joy dissipating by a tad. "Miss Fisher's placenta is attaching too low in her uterus." "What does that even mean?" Matthew exclaimed in frustration. "The placenta is where the baby gets its nutrients from through the umbilical cord, but Miss Fisher's placenta is partially covering her uterus. This complication is called placenta previa," he explained in a leveled tone. "Complication?" Matthew paled, feeling the trembling of Kaylyn's hand and knew she was crying. He couldn't look down on her. He simply couldn't. The doctor began to wipe the gel from her stomach. The placenta might migrate throughout the duration of the pregnancy, so you may not have anything to dash. What if it doesn't? Matthew cut in sharply. Both mother and child will be at risk. After 5 months in the pregnancy, you'll have to pay me another visit to know if the placenta has moved, but if not, serious complications may arise, he provided. Matthew raked his hand through his hair, unable to believe that this was happening. Something so similar to what he had experienced in the past. There is no surety that everything will be fine during or after giving birth, the doctor continued. Kaylyn laid there sobbing as she was too befuddled by the news to even form words. She felt like a part of her was being torn out and she couldn't do anything to ease the pain. She wanted her baby. She wanted someone to love her and she wanted someone to call her own. Though the baby had been nothing short of a surprise, every day had made her realize that she needed it more than anything else. She had been excited, but now, like the many things she had to go through in life, this was another trial. Matthew, on the other hand, couldn't help feeling dreadful. He was confused and his heart was breaking. The doctor was telling them in pretty terms that either Kaylyn or the baby could die during birth. He knew he couldn't lose Kaylyn, and he didn't want to lose his child either, but he had to make a choice, no matter how hard. Is an abortion advised at this time? He asked, and although saying the words ripped apart his heart, he knew it had to be said. Chapter 2. Matthew flinched upon hearing Kaylyn's gasp, caused by his earlier proclamation. Since she's not too far in the pregnancy, it could be considered, but as I said before, the placenta may migrate further on in the pregnancy, he announced, clearly pitying them for the situation they were in. And what if it doesn't? Matthew asked ruefully, his mind in a chaotic battle of indecision. I'm not aborting my child. Kaylyn exclaimed, and although her voice was shaky, the conviction was still evident. Matthew turned, looking down at her eyes, which pooled with tears. Her nose was red and her eyes were puffy, making her look like the most vulnerable thing he had ever seen. He wanted to hug her, cry with her, but he hardened his jaw and said instead, Kaylyn, I don't want this at all. I don't know what else to do, but you may die, he said in a low tone, so low that the doctor couldn't hear. Kaylyn saw the sadness in his eyes, and she knew that he was sad and hurting too, but the baby may die too, she croaked out. Matthew sat beside her, holding her hand in his, as he brought it to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on the soft surface. We can try for another baby after this, he said, wanting to plant another option in her head. She shook her head negatively as he spoke. But I may not have another one, she spoke. We can adopt then, Matthew was eager to convince her. What was he even saying? Matthew thought. He knew that his words were far-fetched and stupid even, but he didn't want Kaylyn to lose hope on any available options. He had to plant some kind of hope in her head. After 5 months in the pregnancy, you'll have to pay me another visit to know if the placenta has moved, but if not, serious complications may arise, he provided. Matthew raked his hand through his hair, unable to believe that this was happening. Something so similar to what he had experienced in the past. There is no surety that everything will be fine during or after giving birth, the doctor continued. Kaylyn laid there sobbing as she was too befuddled by the news to even form words. She felt like a part of her was being torn out and she couldn't do anything to ease the pain. She wanted her baby. She wanted someone to love her and she wanted someone to call her own. Though the baby had been nothing short of a surprise, every day had made her realize that she needed it more than anything else. She had been excited, but now, like the many things she had to go through in life, this was another trial. Matthew, on the other hand, couldn't help feeling dreadful. He was confused and his heart was breaking. The doctor was telling them in pretty terms that either Kaylyn or the baby could die during birth. He knew he couldn't lose Kaylyn, and he didn't want to lose his child either, but he had to make a choice, no matter how hard. Is an abortion advised at this time? He asked, and although saying the words ripped apart his heart, he knew it had to be said. Chapter 26. Matthew flinched upon hearing Kaylyn's gasp, caused by his earlier proclamation. Since she's not too far in the pregnancy, it could be considered, but as I said before, the placenta may migrate further on in the pregnancy, he announced, clearly pitying them for the situation they were in. And what if it doesn't? Matthew asked ruefully, his mind in a chaotic battle of indecision. I'm not aborting my child. Kaylyn exclaimed, and although her voice was shaky, the conviction was still evident. Matthew turned, looking down at her eyes, which pooled with tears. Her nose was red and her eyes were puffy, making her look like the most vulnerable thing he had ever seen. He wanted to hug her, cry with her, but he hardened his jaw and said instead, Kaylyn, I don't want this at all. I don't know what else to do, but you may die, he said in a low tone, so low that the doctor couldn't hear. Kaylyn saw the sadness in his eyes, and she knew that he was sad and hurting too, but the baby may die too, she croaked out. Matthew sat beside her, holding her hand in his, as he brought it to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on the soft surface. Yo, we can try for another baby after this, he said, wanting to plant another option in her head. She shook her head negatively as he spoke. But I may not have another one, she spoke. We can adopt then, Matthew was eager to convince her. What was he even saying? Matthew thought. He knew that his words were far-fetched and stupid even, but he didn't want Kaylyn to lose hope on any available options. He had to plant some kind of hope in her head. No. We are not even a couple. I won, she cried, trailing off as she was unsure of what else to say. Matthew rested his forehead on their entwined hands, trying to control himself and the situation. Don't you understand, Kaylyn? His voice grew by a tad. You may die, he exclaimed, looking deeply into her teary eyes. There was a small silence. Then at least I'd know that I would have lived somehow, she said, easing up on the bed while she used her unoccupied hand to try to wipe her face. Matthew, I'm going to have this baby, and I don't care if I die after. I can't believe you would even think about aborting your own child, she sniffed, and Matthew could see the disappointment in her eyes. She swung her feet over the bed and strolled silently behind a curtain to get dressed. Matthew sighed heavily, looking at the doctor who still stood there, watching the display with empathy. What must I do? He asked in a desperate reach for answers. She doesn't want to abort the child, so I guess there is nothing you can do about that. However, you can help by making her take it easy for the duration of her pregnancy. No stress, no strenuous work, and she should take the medications I prescribed on a daily basis. Ensure that she eats right and takes rest. Miss Fisher has a rare complication here, but also a serious one. I hope that when next you visit me, the placenta will migrate, he completed with a smile. Matthew listened to every bit of what the doctor told him, making sure that he would do the right thing when they went home. He raked a hand through his hair, still not quite at ease with the events of the day. Feeling a firm hold on his tensed shoulder, Matthew looked up to find the doctor with a slight smile on his face. I can see that you care for her, young man, and that's good. She'll need all the love she can get to go through this phase, but be aware, no sex, he smiled, then strolled from the room. Is Kaylyn going to be okay? Sapphire sobbed in Liz's arms. She was doing so for quite some time and Liz wasn't sure what could stop her. You have to believe that she will, honey, she told her, not wanting to give her false hope. It's all because of that stupid baby, she cursed, believing that the baby was the cause of Kaylyn's hurt. I don't want it to come anymore. She pouted, still shedding silent tears. No, Saf, Liz cut herself off when she heard a voice asking about Kaylyn. She turned around and saw Catherine Bell and two other elderly persons she didn't quite recognize. Sapphire eased from Liz's lap and Liz watched as her expression hardened upon seeing them. Before she could understand what was happening, Sapphire marched towards them, with determined strides. What are you doing here? She asked bitterly, staring up at Catherine specifically. Excuse me, little girl, Catherine began, but was cut off by a very indignant Sapphire. We don't want any of you here. You yelled at Kaylyn and slapped her. She tilted her head to glare at Patrick and Lilith. Where is Kaylyn? Lilith asked sternly. She's sick all because you shouted at her and made the baby upset, she yelled angrily, her little voice ringing out in the room. Catherine scoffed. Get out of our way, you little brat, she hissed, attempting to push Sapphire to one side. That attempt, however, failed when Sapphire kicked her on the shin. Catherine expelled a hearty ouch as he crouched, clutching her paining leg. Sapphire then pushed her forcefully, causing her to fall to the floor, landing on her bottom in a thud. You little brat! Catherine yelled, and Sapphire folded her arms across her chest. Bitch, she fired back, using the curse word she had picked up at school. Sapphire! Liz scolded disapprovingly. She pouted her little pink lips. She started it. What's going on here? A voice asked firmly from behind, and everyone spun around to find Matthew with Kaylyn by her side. Sapphire rushed towards them, a wide grin on her face. Kaylyn, she expelled in a relieved tone, hugging her legs. Kaylyn smiled amidst her sadness and gently patted Sapphire on the shoulders. At least she had someone to lift her spirits for the time being. Seeing Catherine, Matthew became furious. Strolling determinedly to confront her, he grabbed her arms, pulling her to face him. A slight gasp escaped her lips upon seeing the murderous look on Matthew's face, and she couldn't quite control the fear that coursed through her body. She knew the man was a tough cookie, but the look on his face now proved to her what great deal of an understatement tough was. You really have some nerve coming here, woman, he hissed bitterly, deadly. Now get the hell out of here before I do something that will grant you a stay downstairs, he sneered, referring to the hospital's morgue. She paled, looking aghast. I was just Dash. I don't need to hear it, he growled now, his face reddening with anger. Leave, he spat, releasing his hold on her so she could do so. The force by which he released her seemed like a shove, and so Catherine stumbled but quickly regained her balance. She swallowed visibly, looking embarrassed, before she spun on her heels. Catherine, Matthew called, and she turned to face him, her eyes slightly blurry with tears. You will live to regret this, he threatened, and she blanched further, knowing every word to be true. Matthew was always a man of his word. After she disappeared around the corner, Matthew turned to the Fishers. Do I need to repeat myself, or did you get the gist? He asked, cocking a brow. We just wanted to know how our daughter was doing, Patrick exclaimed weakly. Daughter? Matthew raised a brow in mocked surprise. I thought she held no relations with you. He didn't take his eyes from Patrick's, and so the poor man was left prey to his deadly glare. Patrick sighed, feeling defeated. Looking over Matthew's shoulders, he saw Kaylyn behind looking in their direction. It had been years since he had seen his daughter, and now that he was given the opportunity, he felt like a new man, even though the situation in which they met was not a good one. She looked just like the Kaylyn he knew and remembered, with her kindness shining in her eyes and the remarkable beauty of her face. The sadness was visibly etched in her face, and Patrick wanted to hug her, like he'd always do when she was a child, and sad when Lilith would shout at her. All the memories came back to him in bullet speed, an array of emotions making themselves known. Patrick knew that even if he didn't live to get the chance to speak with Kaylyn, he would be a happy man, because he had found his lost treasure and saw its beauty. Kaylyn, I'm sorry, he said the words, wanting them to reach the ears of his daughter, but they were only audible to his. Patrick, a voice rang out, pulling Patrick from his thoughts. He spun around and saw a scowl on Lilith's face. I'd be calling your name repeatedly. Let's go, she hissed in frustration. Patrick turned to once again look at Kaylyn, but this time she had her head hung. His eyes burned with the knowledge that his daughter was so close to him, and yet he couldn't say a word. Good luck with that one, Mayhew. You're going to need it, Lilith scoffed. Matthew ground his teeth so hard he thought they'd shatter in his mouth, knowing that the only thing that prevented him from knocking out the woman cold was the unfortunate fact that she was a woman. They spun on their heels and left, Patrick's eyes never leaving Kaylyn until the door to the elevator prevented him from doing so. He sighed when he was in the elevator, raking his hand through his hair. He stiffened when strands of his already receding hair came out in his hand. Swallowing hard, he quickly shoved it in his pocket before Lilith saw. This was one of the apparent side effects of having cancer and being on chemo. Matthew turned to Sapphire and Kaylyn after watching the retreating fishers. "You guys ready to go home?" he asked, realizing that his anger had dissipated upon seeing them. "I thought you'd never ask, Daddy," Sapphire exclaimed with a sigh. "I want to make mac and cheese for Kaylyn," she beamed in excitement. Matthew smiled. "You can't make that." "No, but you will help me," she grinned, and Matthew shook his head, reaching for the small bag that Kaylyn held with the medications. "I'll manage," she quipped, walking away and leaving Matthew to stare at the spot she had earlier occupied. Sapphire sighed as she too walked away, muttering a disgusted "Men." Matthew shook his head and sighed, realizing that Kaylyn was still angry with him. He had a lot of making up to do, it seemed. When they arrived home, Matthew immediately ventured to the kitchen to prepare something for them to eat. It occurred to him that Sapphire remembered nothing of her plan to make mac and cheese for Kaylyn. She stuck to Kaylyn like a bad habit. And although Matthew thought Kaylyn needed the time to herself, he also noticed how Sapphire lit up her entire state. Matthew smiled faintly as he began to chop up the vegetables to put in the soup he was about to prepare, chicken soup to be precise. He was slicing the carrot when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Wondering who it might be, although he wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone, Matthew pulled the phone from his pocket. Jason's name popped up on the screen and Matthew's features hardened almost instantly. He still had not forgiven the guy for not dismissing Kaylyn. Well, he thought in disdain. He wouldn't have a choice in the matter now. "Hey," he answered, leaning his head to his shoulder with the phone stuck between while he continued with what he was doing. The night was upon them and he didn't want Sapphire and Kaylyn to fall asleep without having something to eat. "Didn't you see the missed calls on your phone, dude? I've been trying to get a hold of you all evening. I even went as far as going to your house, only to find that you weren't there," Jason exclaimed from the other end, clearly frustrated with Matthew. Matthew exhaled a deep breath. "No, I didn't see them, sorry. I was busy with." He trailed off, contemplating on whether or not he should disclose the information of the former situation to his friend. "Busy with what?" Jason pressed curiously, and Matthew resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "What was so important that you had to be hunting me down?" Matthew asked, deciding on a change of subject. I just wanted to have a drink and have a chat, like we used to, and it's been a long time since I saw Saph," he exclaimed, and although the tone in his voice was one of pure bravado, his words spoke of the opposite. He didn't want to disclose with his friend the real reason for his supposed visit. What Jason wanted was what he could not say, for his reason sported long red hair and a beauty that was undeniable. Matthew, being oblivious of the motives of his friend, only chuckled. "Oh. Well, how about a rain check?" he asked, deciding that talking to a friend was what he really needed to get his mind off things. "Sure. Tomorrow?" Jason was eager for an early meet because he desperately wanted to look upon the face of his new obsession. Matthew's brows shot up at that, but he paused and thought about it anyway. "Okay then, see you then." "Great." Jason disconnected the call as a surge of excitement consumed his body. Matthew shrugged as he placed the phone on the counter. He didn't know how he would break the news to Jason, but he was somewhat happy that he was going to, because then Jason would see why Kaylyn would no longer work at his establishment. Amidst the chaos that still held residence in his head, Matthew smiled. Kaylyn had gotten a moment to inform her best friend of what she had gone through, what she was going through. Faith had always been there for her, always living up to her name. When it came to their friendship, she spoke to her about everything, and now that she was going through one of her worst phases in life, she didn't want to exclude her from it. She remembered the hysteria in her voice when she had informed her of everything, and Kaylyn knew that phone talk was not the best way to break such important news, but she didn't think she could manage sitting before her friend and telling her everything while she sat before her. Now she waited patiently, awaiting the arrival of Faith, who could always make her feel better, but while she waited, she still had someone who could put a smile on her face despite her sadness. She was jarred from her thoughts when Sapphire's head came into her line of vision. She looked at Kaylyn intently, her face mere inches away from hers. She then followed the direction in which Kaylyn's eyes were focused. Pouting, Sapphire exclaimed. "I don't see what you're looking at. There's only a wall." Kaylyn chuckled lightly. She must have staring out of space for Sapphire to prompt such a statement. "Daddy is in the kitchen cooking. He says that we have to eat before going to bed," she informed, jumping up on the bed. Kaylyn was surprised at that, for she never once took Matthew for the chef. She remembered the breakfast he had once prepared, and she had to admit, it was good, but bacon and eggs didn't require much culinary skill. She sighed, feeling a pang of sadness as her thoughts constantly drifted back and forth to the events of the day. Her heart still felt too heavy and her eyes still stung with the promise of tears, but she sucked it up, knowing that sometimes that was the best way to get over things. "You still feel sad, don't you?" Sapphire's little voice came, sounding just like the mood of her question. Kaylyn turned to look at her and realized that she looked sad. Managing a faint smile, she patted Saph on the cheek. "I'll be fine," she told her, although she knew deep down that fine was a long-lost feeling to her. "When you weren't here and I was sad and didn't have anyone to talk to, Liz always told me to talk to God." "I don't know who he is," she shrugged, hunching her shoulders. "But Liz said he always makes things better," she smiled. Kaylyn's lips trembled with a smile. "We can talk to him together," she asked rather than stated, and Kaylyn managed a nod, thinking of how great Sapphire and her suggestion was. "Hey God, it's me Sapphire. Again, I brought a new friend," she began, and Kaylyn placed a hand on her stomach as she listened to Sapphire's prayer. Patrick sat in the garden, drinking sweet tea, as it was the only thing that made him feel alive other than the thought of seeing his daughter. Allowing the fresh, floral scent of the flowers to fill his lungs, he inhaled deeply, closing his eyes in the process. "Patrick dear," Lilith's shrilling voice came, causing Patrick's eyes to pop open. Releasing a light sigh, he smiled. "Yes, darling." He sounded weak, a fact his wife didn't notice. "Such a waste, didn't you think?" she exclaimed frustratingly, seating herself beside her husband. "What was?" Patrick asked, his mind distant from the conversation, but so close to his Kaylyn. "That flight to New York," she informed with a bit of annoyance. "It was pretty clear that it was all a ploy to lure us to the God-forsaken place." "I can't believe Catherine," she hissed. "But I shall confront her when next we converse." What in the heavens was she thinking bringing us to Mayhew's place when she knew damn well Kaylyn was going to be there? Lilith spoke incessantly, using hand gestures to express herself. "I didn't think it was a waste," Patrick managed, thinking that he got to see Kaylyn. Lilith scoffed. "You wouldn't even think garbage was waste. Patrick shook his head slowly as he refocused his attention on the sweet scent of nature and from his bitter wife. "Anyway, it's dark, you should be getting in, Lilith began as she stood to leave. "Lilith, I'm going back to see Kaylyn," Patrick cut in. Lilith stopped in her tracks immediately, her body stiff as she turned to face him. "Dear, are you not feeling well?" she asked in genuine concern, but it was pure mockery. "I'm fine," Patrick snapped. "Don't try to talk me out of it. You have done so for years, but this time I'm going to see my baby girl," he ground out between tightly clenched teeth as he stood, glaring at as Lilith was flabbergasted by her husband's tone, for it was one that she was not accustomed to, and so she stood, mouth slightly opened in shock as Patrick stepped past her. He didn't have much time left, and he couldn't be delayed for another day. His time was dwindling and there was nothing anyone could do to stop him, not even death. Matthew smiled to himself as he looked down on the 2 steaming bowls of chicken soup. Wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, he placed them on a tray. Without a reason, Matthew found himself laughing, he didn't know why, because his thoughts were still chaotic and the atmosphere held no humor. As he climbed the stairs and came upon Kaylyn's room, he heard the faint murmuring of the conversation which took place between Sapphire and Kaylyn. This time however, Matthew didn't allow his curiosity to get the better of him, so instead of standing silently to grasp a part of the convo, Matthew steadied the tray in one hand and knocked on the door. He listened as the conversation stilled, and within a few seconds, the door burst open with Sapphire smiling up at him. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said a bit frustratingly, but the smile still held residence on her face. Matthew smiled and entered, his eyes immediately moving to Kaylyn, who sat on the bed with a Scrabble game board in front of her. She glanced at Matthew, but her eyes did not hold his. Clearing his throat, Matthew went to place the tray on a small table at one corner of the room. "Chicken soup always helps," he exclaimed, immediately cringing at his words. "I know you guys must have been hungry," he smiled quickly, ruffling Sapphire's hair. "Thank you," Kaylyn managed. "Yes, thanks Daddy," Sapphire beamed. Matthew nodded, not knowing what else to do or say in the awkward situation. He wasn't a pro when it came to emotional affairs, and so it left him prey to two pairs of scrutinizing eyes, and tension so thick, it could be touched. So I'll just leave. If there's anything you guys need, just ask," he said, then went through the door. He sighed when he was in the hallway. Seeing Kaylyn's face had only reminded him of what transpired earlier and the threat that was still present with her and the baby. Even though she smiled, Matthew could see that it was a mask for how she really felt. Her eyes now held a permanent mist, and Matthew was only awaiting the moment when it would be too overwhelming for her to keep her tears in. The ringing of the doorbell brought him from his thoughts and left him wondering who it might be. He didn't want any visitors now, and he was going to make it clear to whoever it might be. Kaylyn needed rest and he didn't need company. Determinedly, Matthew strode down the stairs and moved to the door, with a scowl etched on his face. He opened the door to find a woman leaning against the wall. Her mind was distant, Matthew realized as she stared into the night, oblivious of the fact that the door was now opened. "Who are you and what are you doing here at this hour?" he exclaimed, and the woman almost jumped from the sudden harshness in his tone. Her head snapped towards Matthew, and she gave him a thorough once-over with a frown on her face. "You?" she spat, with the highest level of distaste. Matthew's brow shot up, wondering who this strange person was who spoke to him in such a manner. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded crisply. The woman ignored his question as she pushed past him. "Where's Kaylyn?" she asked, wildly looking around. Matthew's frown deepened as he grabbed her arm, jerking her towards him. The expression on her face still had not changed even though strong hands encircled a slim arm. "Who the hell are you and what the fuck do you want?" he seethed, thinking that he'd be damned if he allowed a stranger to waltz in his house without a tinge of respect for him or his household. Well, a bit violent don't you think?" She cocked a brow in challenge. "Is that what you did to Kaylyn for her to end up in the hospital, Mayhew?" she hissed. "I swear to God if I find out that you touched a hair in her head, you'll pay, and it won't be money," she warned threateningly. Matthew scoffed, not allowing his brain to believe the words that flew from her mouth. Anger aroused itself within him in the ugliest manner, his nose flaring. Tightening his hold on her arm, he spoke between tightly clenched teeth. "Get out." The words were slow, bitter, and deadly. But the woman did not cower before him. She held her head high and sized him up. "Not until I see Kaylyn," she bit out firmly, and even though his hold on her began to hurt, she ignored it as she stared into the soulless eyes of Matthew Mayhew. She couldn't ignore the pang of fear that consumed her as she saw the murderous look on the man's face, but she knew she couldn't fall prey to the aristocrat. Matthew was trying to hold on to his anger in the best way he could, but the more he stared at the woman and replayed the words she had thrown at him, the more he found that task hard to do. He was already in turmoil with the fact that Kaylyn and his child was at a high risk, but to have someone so blatantly accuse him of it was simply unacceptable. What kind of man would he be if he dared to harm the mother of his child, and his child? The woman had keen past her limits, but Matthew knew just how to put her in reverse. He moved and reopened the door, the woman still in the grasp of his hands. She stumbled as she tried to keep up with the fast pace in which he was moving. Matthew gently shoved her on the outside, but the woman was still unbalanced from the stumble, so she fell to the ground. She gasped as her but made contact with the hard concrete, her mouth slightly opened with the shock of her fall. Matthew muttered a small curse, not having wanted to make her fall, but seeing her there, made him slightly contented. "Faith?" Kaylyn's startled voice came, and Matthew's eyes slightly widened with the knowledge. She was Faith? He turned around and found Kaylyn moving towards them in quick strides, hurt and fear evident on her face. Matthew inwardly cursed himself, seeing that he might have just put Kaylyn through another round of stress, which was the last thing she needed. What happened here? Kaylyn shrieked, looking at Matthew for answers. He raked a hand through his hair in frustration. He wanted to take Kaylyn to her bedroom and have her rest her pretty little head on the pillows and sleep, having no knowledge of what happened. He didn't want her to argue or stress, he just wanted her to drink soup and sleep, but Matthew knew that wasn't going to happen now. Look, I'm sorry. I shouldn't. He tried to apologize to Faith in order to lighten the mood, but he was interrupted by Kaylyn. Matthew, did you push her? She asked with wide eyes. He once again tried to defend himself, but once again interrupted. He did. Faith cut in sharply, looking at Matthew with a hateful glare. She then turned her arm to Kaylyn, showing her the deep red marks. And this? Her eyes didn't leave him as she spoke. Kaylyn gasped, darting her eyes at him. The look she gave him was one of utter disappointment and hurt. Matthew's hate for Faith grew by a tad. Kaylyn stared at the marks encircling her friend's arm. They were already turning a shade of blue, and she felt disgusted by the knowledge of Matthew inflicting such harm to her friend. She saw the look on his face when she had just ventured down the stairs. He looked murderous at the time, but what was his reason for manhandling Faith? Kaylyn thought to herself. She had only planned on having her friend over so they could chat because Kaylyn knew she would feel better, but this? It was unexpected as well as disappointing. Throwing Matthew a steely glare, she said. What the hell were you thinking? Matthew sighed. I was thinking that I was showing a stranger out of my house, he defended. She's my friend. Kaylyn cried out in hysteria. Matthew was trying to calm her because he knew all this was not healthy for her. Bruising and shoving her? Have you gone mad? She hissed, looking at him in disgust. I didn't. He tried to defend again. You are unbelievable. Kaylyn exclaimed, once again cutting him off. Can you listen to me for a second please? He snapped in frustration. I didn't know she was your friend. She came into my house without acknowledging me or herself, now what the hell was I to do when I had no prior knowledge of her? Matthew hissed, his jaw hardening. I told you I was here to see Kaylyn. Common sense could have told you I was her friend, Faith interjected ruefully. Matthew cast a nasty glare in her direction. Kaylyn, he clearly doesn't know how to treat people, women especially, Faith cursed. Shut the hell up, woman. Matthew roared angrily, his hands twitching with the need to throw the woman from his house. Matthew, stop. Kaylyn hissed. You're telling me to stop? He cocked a questioning brow. Maybe you should take a look at the friends you keep, Kaylyn. This woman here started this, and she doesn't have any consideration for your health as well as the baby's. This is not what you need right now, after what happened earlier. Matthew exclaimed, with fiercely narrowed dark eyes. For a moment everyone was quiet. I want her out of my house, now, he demanded tersely. Faith gasped, gawking at Matthew. Matthew, I asked her here, Kaylyn croaked. Matthew was determined to have the woman out, and not even the pleas of Kaylyn could change his mind. And now I want her out, he spoke between tightly clenched teeth. Kaylyn's eyes blurred with tears as she stared at him. Then I'm going home, she exclaimed shakily, and Matthew stilled, swallowing hard. That was far from what he wanted, but he felt like he was the only one trying when it came to their situation. Who's stopping you? He asked blankly, his face now expressionless. He regretted the words as soon as he saw the look on Kaylyn's face. Nothing could have prepared Kaylyn for the words which came from Matthew's mouth. She didn't know what she should have been expecting, but his retort was simply not it. The words rested on her heart uncomfortably, and not even the tears that threatened to spill could wash away his dreadful words. Asshole. Come on, Kay. Let's go pack, Faith said, gently placing her arms around Kaylyn's back in assurance. Kaylyn and Matthew were still staring at each other, and soon Kaylyn felt a tear slip from her eyes. She sniffed, looking away, while she quickly brushed it off. Clearing her throat, she nodded, stepping past Matthew, who still stood at the same spot, motionless. As Kaylyn climbed the stairs, she had to fold her lips in order to hold back the dam that would soon burst in her eyes. Faith was rambling on about something that Kaylyn didn't quite get because her mind was distant. Of course Kaylyn had only spoken the words out of anger and frustration, but she hadn't been expecting him to reply so bitterly. She wanted to take the words back, but there was nothing she could do now. The damage was already done. With a heavy heart, she entered her room, seeing Sapphire still drinking her soup. She turned and smiled when she saw Kaylyn, and that made her heart break a little more. She moved towards Kaylyn, looking up at Faith. "Hi, you must be Faith," she smiled. Faith glanced at Kaylyn, wondering who the little person was. "She is, Sapphire, meet Faith." "Faith, this is Sapphire," Kaylyn said, and although her words were meant to be bright, it was the complete opposite. Faith only smiled, as she moved towards Kaylyn's closet, immediately starting her task of packing. "Why are you taking out Kaylyn's stuff?" Sapphire asked in dismay, and Kaylyn stiffened, not knowing how she'd break the news to her. She started saying, but was interrupted by Faith. "She's going home, honey," she said, with not an ounce of consideration for the child's feelings. Sapphire's head snapped up to Kaylyn, her mouth slightly opened with shock. "What?" she asked in a strained tone. "Saph, I'm leaving, honey." "You're leaving? Why?" Her voice was heavy with emotions. "I have to go back home," she managed a smile, gently placing her hand on her cheeks. Sapphire drew back at her touch. "You can't leave me, Kaylyn." "You just can't," she blabbered shakily. Kaylyn swallowed. "I'll visit you," she tried to lighten the situation. A tear slipped from her eyes. "Please, don't leave," she cried. Kaylyn sighed lightly as she knelt to the floor, wanting to properly look at Sapphire's face. She smiled, and brushed the tears from her rosy cheeks. "I'm so sorry, honey. If you think I talk too much, I can stop. I won't tell you to call the baby lasagna again. I promise." She clasped her hands and brought it to her chest. "I won't bother you. I'll do anything you wanna, but please don't leave me, Kaylyn," Sapphire cried, staring into Kaylyn's eyes while the tears fell. Kaylyn swallowed the lump in her throat, contemplating on her decisions. "Kid, I'm sorry, but Kaylyn has to go," Faith cut in. Sapphire ignored Faith as she saw Matthew passing by the door. Her spirits lifted as she squealed, "Daddy," and immediately ran towards Matthew. He stopped at the door, not looking at anyone else in the room, but his daughter. "Daddy, Kaylyn wants to go home." "Please don't let her," she pleaded shakily. Matthew ground his teeth, not knowing what to say, because he simply could not tell her he was the cause for her wanting to leave. The silence in the room was so much that one could hear a pin drop of cotton. Matthew glanced at Kaylyn, who held her head down, and Faith, who was still busy throwing things in Kaylyn's suitcase. He finally glanced at Sapphire and saw the tears that trailed down her flushed face, and the way her little lips trembled. She stared at Matthew unblinkingly as the tears fell, and Matthew instantly knew that if he disappointed his daughter again, he wasn't sure she'd forgive him. Folding his lips, he turned to Kaylyn. "May I have a word with you, please?" he asked, and saw how Faith paused at that, swirling her head around in curiosity. Privately, Matthew added firmly, his gaze darting to Faith. Kaylyn was hesitant, but she then nodded, moving towards the door. Matthew took one quick glance at Sapphire, who smiled through her tears. He smiled faintly, moving behind Kaylyn, who was standing in the hallway. Closing the door, he came face to face with her. Her eyes still didn't meet his, and Matthew lightly sighed, moving further down in the passage before he stopped a few inches from his bedroom door. Clearing his throat, he began. "Kaylyn, I'm sorry," he started. She didn't react to his apology, and so he continued. "I shouldn't have done what I did or said what I said," he swallowed, folding his arms. "I don't really care about what you said to me," she lied. "It's what you did to Faith," she exclaimed. Matthew sighed. I didn't intend to make her fall. Wanting her out of my house, however, I will not apologize for," he ground out ruefully. "She's my friend, my only friend, and if I can't have her over here when I want to, then I'll have to go home. I won't be a prisoner here, Matt. Do you know what your dear old friend said to me?" he blurted, then bit his lips, not wanting to sound harsh. What? Kaylyn croaked out, before clearing her throat. Matthew was silent as he contemplated on whether or not he should tell Kaylyn about Faith's accusation. He really wanted to tell her and let her realize that he wasn't the bad guy in the situation, but he pulled back the words because he didn't want Kaylyn to have a quarrel with her best friend. He didn't want to put her through another stressful phase. So instead, he shook his head. "Never mind that, but Kaylyn, please don't leave, I beg of you. Sapphire will be heartbroken and I don't know if I'll be able to handle that," he exclaimed, wanting to mention hers and the baby's well-being, but he knew that would probably only worsen the situation. "Matthew, I won't live here forever, so at one point Sapphire will have to come to terms with the news," Kaylyn said softly. "Kaylyn, I'm trying here. I'm really trying to change for my children's sake, so with the consideration of their well-being as well as yours, I'm pleading with you. Please don't leave," he exclaimed softly. "I will make a lot of mistakes, but I'm only human," he completed a bit shakily. Kaylyn saw the sincerity in his eyes, and although she was feeling vulnerable and drained, she knew that what he was saying was true. She understood. "If you want to have Faith over, then fine, I won't argue with you about it," Matthew added, although he didn't want her around. Kaylyn stood staring at him for a moment, until she bit her lips, feeling the wave of unexpected emotions that consumed her. She had thought that she had felt hurt and vulnerable when she had left her parents' home, but now she felt worse. She had been through a lot in the past weeks, and all those emotions settled on her throat, making it burn with the heaviness. She bit her lips as a tear escaped her eye, and she immediately tried to move, to get away before Matthew saw, but her attempts were unsuccessful as Matthew grabbed her by the arms and pulled her into his. She didn't try to pull away, she just buried her face in his chest and cried. Matthew held her close and placed a gentle kiss on the top of her head while his hand busied itself with massaging her back. He understood how she might have felt, and what woman wouldn't feel that way after everything she had gone through. He knew that he was partially to be blamed for some of her hurt, but he was going to try his very best to make it up to her. Matthew knew that they had a long way to go, but he also knew that with every success story, there was a beginning. Chapter 30. "I still can't believe you decided to stay after all," Faith sighed, when she got out of bed the following morning. She had decided that she would stay with her friend for the night even though she was an unwelcome guest to the host. Kaylyn slightly shook her head. "I shouldn't have said I wanted to go in the first place," she exclaimed while pulling on a pair of roomy cotton pants. "He basically told you to leave the house," Faith exclaimed in disbelief. Tying the knot to her pants, Kaylyn paused, taking a long glance at her friend. "Can you just please stop it? Even if I went home, I don't know how I would manage. I can't work now, so how could I even afford food and bills?" she sighed heavily. "I could help you out," she said, and Kaylyn snorted. "We both know you couldn't, so just chill," she told her while pulling on a shirt that almost swallowed her entire form. "Mayhew is a douche. You don't need him in your life," Faith snide crisply. "He's trying to change," Kaylyn muttered softly, hanging her head. Faith gawked at her. "Please tell me I heard you wrong," she exclaimed. Kaylyn was silent, as she turned, looking for a clip to bound her hair. She also didn't want Faith to see the blush that was slowly creeping up to her cheeks. Faith groaned loudly, and Kaylyn spun around to see what was wrong. "What?" she asked, a bit fearful. "You like him, don't you?" she declared, curious for an answer. Kaylyn pursed her lips and padded to the dressing table in search of that clip. Did she like Matthew? Well, she didn't hate him, so she guessed like was the only explainable feeling. Her thoughts took her to the previous night, when Matthew had held her in his arms while she cried. Even though she felt so lost at the time, she had found comfort in the warmth of his embrace. She felt safe and secure in his strong arms, and although the parting was immensely awkward, they both had managed a smile and Kaylyn had confirmed that she would stay. She really saw that he was trying, so she had to give him that. He wasn't so bad after all. OMG. You really like him. Your face is the color of beetroots right now, Faith's shrilling voice came in for a moment. Kaylyn had forgotten that she was being assessed by her friend. Faith, how I feel doesn't really matter, she swallowed hard, trying to avert her gaze from that of her friend. I can't believe you'd like someone like him, she blared in disbelief. I can't believe you're pressing me about my feelings for Matthew. He is not my number one priority at the moment. My baby is, she snapped, getting frustrated with Faith. But still, just stop. Please, Kaylyn blurted harshly. I can't believe that even though I called you here as a friend so we could talk about what I have been through, you have not once asked me about my well-being or my babies. I needed a friend and right now, she trailed off, swallowing the hurtful lump in her throat. Right now, I feel as though I have none, she completed shakily. Kaylyn, It's fine, she quickly cut in. I feel fine, because I have a 5-year-old here who would do anything to see me happy. I'm sore, Kaylyn, breakfast is ready, Sapphire said, bursting through the door with a smile in place. We're loading your content, stay tuned. Thanks babe, I will be down shortly, she smiled and Sapphire nodded, sending a steely gaze in Faith's direction. Kaylyn left, leaving Faith to stand alone in the room. Porridge and egg sandwiches were served at a small table in the kitchen. Kaylyn entered, noticing that Matthew only stood at the counter, drinking what she presumed to be coffee. Good morning, she said politely, before taking a seat around the table. Good morning, he greeted. Sapphire grinned, realizing that Kaylyn and her daddy were getting along. Matthew stood, watching Kaylyn over the rim of the cup as he drank his coffee. She looked better this morning, he thought, but he longed to see her baby bump. He knew it wasn't big, just a small mound, but he wanted to see the baby's growth, and he couldn't do that with the large clothing she wore. He appreciated her modesty, but heck. Matthew's face hardened when he saw Faith entering the room. Averting his gaze, he took another sip of his coffee before he left the room. Faith sighed watching him leave. I'm going, she softly told Kaylyn, whose head snapped up. Faith, it's fine We'll talk, she said with a wan smile. Kaylyn got up from around the table and hugged her tightly. Knowing that amidst their little disagreement, Faith had always been a good friend. I'm sorry, she consoled. I am too, she smiled and quickly pulled Kaylyn in again for another brief hug. Faith left the room and moved towards the door when she almost bumped into Matthew. She paused, looking at him before she sighed after seeing the scowl that was etched on her face. You better take care of her, she warned before she stepped past him. Matthew watched as she exited the house, before he released a sigh of relief. He really did not like the woman at all. Matthew sent Sapphire on a play date with her friend Judy in the afternoon, leaving him and Kaylyn to be the only occupant of the house. Even though Sapphire had protested, saying that she wanted to be with Kaylyn, Matthew had convinced her that she also had a friend who was looking forward to the play date. With a heavy heart, she had left, but not before hugging and advising Kaylyn to take rest. Matthew also thought that Kaylyn needed the time to herself, so with Sapphire gone, she would get just that, even if it was just for a while. Kaylyn, after showering that afternoon, stood before the mirror in just her bra and usual sweatpants. She stood sideways, examining the small bound, while her hand caressed the spot. She bit her lips and turned the other side, where she did the same thing. When she finally turned to the front, she managed a shaky smile, not being able to control the overwhelming wave of emotions that threatened to consume her. Immediately moving towards the dressing table, she took up the glass of water she had bought up and reached for the container with the medications the doctor had prescribed. She swallowed the tiny tablet with great difficulty because she had never been a fan of taking them. Placing the glass on the table, she then moved towards the bed and sat with her hand still on her stomach. Looking down, she smiled. Hi, she said softly. You probably don't recognize me because I've never spoken to you before, she managed a small laugh. But you'll be strong for me, won't you, she asked, although knowing she wouldn't get a reply. A lot of people are depending on you to be fine, okay? I want you to be fine and, she trailed off and licked her lips. Your daddy too, and your sister. When you safely arrive here, I probably won't get to hold you or talk to you but. She trailed off, not being able to continue without composing herself. It really hurt when she really took the time to consider the possibility that her life, as well as the baby's, may be gone in the next 5 months. She didn't want to get emotionally attached to it and so she sometimes distanced herself, not wanting to think about the life that rested in her. She didn't want to get attached because if it turned out that she lived, and the baby died, Kaylyn wasn't sure how she would get over that. It nevertheless was hard not to get attached when she knew she carried life. Kaylyn slowly buried her face in the pillows as she cried, curling herself in a small hall while the tears created a stream down her face. Her sobs became a lullaby to her own ears, and soon she fell asleep with tear-stained cheeks. Matthew was sitting in his study, catching up on some work while he waited for Jason, when he heard the doorbell ring. Thinking that it must have been his friend, he immediately rose from his chair and moved towards the door. Took you long, he stopped in mid-sentence when he realized that it was not his friend who was standing at his door, but Patrick Fisher. Matthew ground his teeth, his hand tightening on the doorknob. What are you doing here, and what the hell do you want? He sneered, and Patrick visibly swallowed.